Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I got to fix my microphone. It's Michael Moynihan of the Moynihan Report. Thanks for joining us. We're doing a slightly different episode today because, as you might have noticed, I talk a lot about history and about the battles over history and about the weaponization, the political weaponization of history. And this year is the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. We're a little bit late on it. We're about a month off, but it's still an interesting issue, and it will still keep coming up because, weirdly, in the past year, every time I look at some sort of silly podcast, and by the way, particularly on the right these days, it could be something that was almost exclusively the domain of the left, this issue is coming up. And it's coming up as an indictment of American foreign policy and American history, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to show you a couple of examples of this, the things that motivated me to get our guest on today to talk about this. And this first clip is Tucker Carlson talking to Joe Rogan, two fantastically famous and well-trafficked podcasters, talking about the atomic bombing in 1945.
Well, you could say the same about the atomic bomb, right?
Yes, you could.
And you could say that we have to develop it like Oppenheimer felt before the Nazis did.
I love that. How'd that work? How'd that work?
Well,
I love, by the way, that people on my side, I'll just admit it, on the right, have spent the last 80 years defending dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. Like, are you joking?
Right.
That's just like prima facie evil.
Yeah.
If you can't, if we hadn't done that, then this, that, the other thing, that was actually a great savings. Like, no, it's wrong to drop nuclear weapons on people. And if you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil. Like it's not a tough one, right? It's not a hard call for you. It's not a hard call for me. So with that in mind, like, why would you want nuclear weapons? It's like just a mindless, childish sort of intellectual exercise to justify, like, oh no, it's really good because someone else will get it. How about no?
How about no? Apparently I'm evil if I look at the history of the end of the Second World War. And incidentally, I don't want to argue with these clips as I present them, but I don't believe that there are many historians arguing about dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. That's not what the argument is. But this is Tucker Carlson, a man of the right, I suppose. These categories are completely scrambled these days. But it used to be, when I started looking into this stuff and studying this stuff, something that was almost exclusively found on the left. And I give you an example. This is Howard Zinn, who died a number of years back, probably in about 2010 or 9 or something like this. This is Howard Zinn's argument on the very same issue.
I don't want to bypass Hiroshima.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, because it is still one of the great myths in American culture that we saved lives by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we did not. And I've done a lot of research on that. And the most elaborate research job on that, done by Gar Alperovitz and a crew of scholars, makes it clear we did not save lives. Japanese were about to surrender. We killed several 100,000 people on.
All right, that was Howard Zinn. Who popularizes these things? Howard Zinn in some sense, but then again, people that are big and are in Hollywood, like Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone, who is no fan of mine, I reviewed his book for the Daily Beast a long time ago, his book that he wrote on American history, his vision of American history, which was riddled with errors, and he got very angry and wrote a very angry letter, which I then responded to. But Stone is somebody who popularizes a lot of nonsense in the universe of history, including his very good movie, JFK, which is one lie after another from beginning to end. But he's kind of obsessed with the atomic bombings in 1945 too, and this is him talking about it.
To use such a weapon. The U.S. had 8 5-star admirals and generals in 1945. 7 of the 8 are officially on the record saying the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. And the 8th was Marshall, who said that the Soviet invasion alone would likely leverage the Japanese into surrender by itself. So they all knew that the atomic bombs were unnecessary. Truman knew it as well as anybody. When he had lunch with Stalin at Potsdam on July 17th, He goes back and writes in his journal, said, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs.
Well, you are a very clever viewer in realizing that's not Oliver Stone, but it's actually Peter Kuznick, who is the co-author of the book with Oliver Stone, who also doesn't like me, just for the record. But you also might notice a little bug in the corner that said that was, again, on the Tucker Carlson show, two men of the left. Stone is on that episode, and Kuznick with a man of the right talking about this. It's a slam dunk case. Everyone agrees. Well, not everyone agrees. I don't agree, and our guest today doesn't either. And he is the historian and lawyer Richard B. Frank. He's the author of a biography of MacArthur, a very good book called Tower of Skulls, The History of the Asia-Pacific War. And the book that we're going to reference mostly today that I bought in 1999 and was influential on my thinking, Downfall, The End of the Imperial Japanese Empire. Richard Frank, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much.
When you see that stuff, I mean, there are so many of these arguments you've confronted in the past. Particularly, there's usually the quote from Eisenhower from 1965, where he says, he's talking about Henry Stimson and saying, well, I told him it wasn't necessary, it was not necessary. And all of these people, and you hear Kuznick say there, all of these big people, admirals, generals, say it wasn't necessary. And the thing that we don't see in those clips is the next thought is typically, it was just employed to scare the Soviets, and it was the opening salvo in the Cold War. What do you make of those arguments?
Well, obviously, I spent a lot of time with this back to the early 1990s, and I've gone through tons of American primary documents, plus Japanese material, which I accessed either in translation or through a very skilled translator. And it's peculiar in one particular sense, and that's that if you deal with, as I have, other Asians who were in territories occupied by Japan, they find this whole thing utterly bizarre. They think that the whole framework that the U.S. has popularized and is followed much in the West, in which we talk about something we call the Pacific War, which really only confronts the conflict across the Pacific between Imperial Japan and the United States. It acknowledges a few other participants, notably the Filipinos, the Australians, the Pacific Islanders, and the New Zealanders to some degree, which is a very tiny percentage of the people who were really wrapped up in Japan's Greater War, which we should understand as the Asia-Pacific War. And that involved not only the people I've already named, the nations and peoples I've already named, but also this whole swath of Asia, starting from India on the west, going on an easterly trajectory across China, Japan, out to the North and Central Pacific, and southeasterly down through Burma and what's now Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand. And basically, the Pacific War only recognizes the participation of about 25% of the people who were involved in the war, and about 15% of the deaths. And the Asia-Pacific theater covers everything else, which is to say it adds in 75% of the participants and 85% of the deaths. And I've dealt now for decades with ordinary citizens and also historians from the Asia-Pacific region, and they find that this whole controversy bizarre, and they have much stronger words for the fact that the mass death in this war was caused by Japan. It was caused across basically other Asian nations. Only about 6% of all the deaths in the Asia-Pacific War were Japanese. That's military and civilians. Civilians are less than 2%. And the other 94% are other peoples, not Japanese, almost all other Asians. Only a very, very small percentage of that total are, in fact, not are other than Asians, non-whites. So this whole thing is sort of this incredibly inverted piece of history, which I hope is eventually going to fade away of its own basic incoherence.
Why? I mean, this started I mean, I guess you could. I mean, it starts back with Gar Alperwitz and these people and the New Left historians, and Robert Maddox and these guys who push back. And there's, he wrote a fantastic book called Weapons for Victory, which I recommend people read. But buy the Frank book first is when you have to buy a Downfall, which covers this stuff too. But this starts really in the popular imagination around 1994 when the Smithsonian exhibit happens, and there's a lot of controversy about how the bombing is portrayed in that exhibit, and it's sort of this new left vision, which, as I point out at the beginning, Tucker Carlson and some of these people, it's not really a left-right thing anymore. So new left was where it started. But why do you think this argument persists to this day? Because it's not really about civilian deaths. As a historian of the Asia-Pacific War, we can just move that camera a little over to Tokyo and the firebombing raids of 1945 of a city that is essentially made of paper and goes up in flames. They're incendiary bombs and kills, I don't know, 100,000 civilians? I mean, I don't know what the numbers. You would know. I think it's around 100,000. Am I right about that?
That's approximately where we're at now.
Yeah.
Some people go a little lower or a little higher, but 100,000 is much more popularly accepted now.
So what is it? What is it about is it just the age that it ushers in? Because the bombing of Hamburg, the bombing of Dresden, these, absolute, I mean, in the proper use of the word Holocaust, this consumption by fire, obviously hideousness in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but that debate sticks with us today. And before we get to whether or not the, arguments of Alperwitz and Oliver Stone et al. Are true, why do you think it's so persistent?
That's a very good question. Let me just adjust the timeline just a bit here to really show that this really did come up. Initially, in 1945, the first news of Japan's surrender was greeted with great jubilation and relief, certainly in the U.S. and elsewhere, and no small sense of relief in Japan, I might add. There was initially a little bit of a tempest. Some Americans, notably some people with certain religions, and then also a famous article that was about Hiroshima that was published in the New Yorker, raised consciousness of what it was really like. Right. But then that was pushed back on by an article by Henry Stimson, the Secretary of, at that point, retired Secretary of War. And the whole issue kind of went into a hiatus of relative quiet. And then, as you indicated, it really came back big time in the 1960s with Alperovitz's book. And then, of course, that was also a period of great turmoil for the Vietnam War. But you're right, that it reached sort of, at least in my view, it reached sort of an apogee with the Enola Gay controversy, which was expressly admitted by the designer to be a large, huge exercise in anti-nuclear politics. So, and it's been with us ever since. And like I said at the beginning, one of the things that if you really get into this and really deal with not just the American Academy or Americans or some Western Europeans, and you actually deal with Asians, and particularly Asians who are not Japanese. I mean, once again, I cannot say enough or strongly enough, they find this bizarre. Mm-hmm. I mean, they think the whole thing is just crazy because when you look at the fact that quite basically there were probably 18 other civilians who died for every Japanese civilian who died in the war. Mm-hmm. It's about, in rough numbers, it's about 25 million total deaths, and that's probably a low-end number for all the Asia-Pacific War. About 6 million are military, 3 million are Chinese, 2 million are Japanese. The balance are everyone else, including people who were serving Japan, some Asians, whatever here. So that leaves 19 million non-combatants. Japanese non-combatant deaths at the highest ends get to about 1 to 1.2 million, of which those who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both immediately and latently, were probably about 210,000. You could go 20,000 above or below that, I suppose. The Hiroshima deaths also include probably at least 20,000 Japanese military personnel who were killed in Hiroshima. Well, this tells you that 18 or almost 18 million other people died in the Asia-Pacific War. And once again, they're almost all Asians. You know, so they start with that basic fact. The slaughter is just totally disproportionate. And when you talk about dropping, quote, nuclear bombs on civilians, you have to understand, just as a for instance, that the government of Japan announced in March 1945 that every single Japanese male aged 15 to 60 who was not already formally part of the armed forces, and every single Japanese female aged 17 to 40 were now part of a national militia, a national military force that would perform combat support and then combat roles against an invasion in Japan. That's about 14 million Japanese. Now, they didn't have uniforms or ways to distinguish those people from ordinary combatants. So basically, the Japanese obliterated distinctions between civilians and military personnel, including civilians in all of those Japanese cities, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, when you get down to the details of what this was like, it's not like Japan was full of innocent civilians in cities and we went ahead and dropped this terrible weapon on them. Japan had totally mobilized itself and indicated it was going to go down to the last extremity to defend its homeland. And that's what we were faced with in 1945. That's reality.
So when you hear the debates, and there are many such books, and I would even say that the more common argument in academia these days is what you, I think, correctly object to the idea that it's a revisionist argument, because revisionism is just what historians do. They revise the record over time. But the argument that the bomb was unnecessary and immoral, the balance seems to have shifted towards that. But the argument that it wasn't in those clips, you see some, a hack historian like Howard Zinn say that no lives were saved. Of course, not differentiating. I mean, American lives were certainly saved. I mean, that's a madness to say that. And of course, they debate constantly about the number of casualties. The projected casualties would have been 20,000, 100,000, a million. But address that broader comment from these people is that the Japanese were ready to surrender. They had no oil left. They'd been choked off. They were ready to give up. I have a very different view of that. And there was obviously people within the Big Six, the people in the war cabinet there that were the balance there was to keep fighting. But what do you say to people that say, look, the Japanese were a defeated nation. They were ready to give up. Just wait a little bit, and it would have happened.
Well, to start with, the Germans were defeated probably by 1943. And I noticed that the war went on there another 2 years, right? I mean, this whole issue of when they were defeated, it wasn't a question of being defeated. It was a question of when and if they were going to surrender. And here's the basic reality. In January 1945, the Japanese had effectively lost their navy. The air power had been reduced enormously in its impotence, but they still had an enormous army under arms in Japan, on the Asian continent and in Japan. And this inner cabinet, which formerly was called the Supreme Council for Direction of the War, which in shorthand is known as the Big Six. Yeah. It's known because it had 6 members. There was the prime minister, a fellow named Suzuki. There was a foreign minister named Togo, who, interestingly, was actually Korean, and he was the only civilian in this Big Six. And you had the army minister, a fellow named Anami. You had a navy minister, a fellow named Yone. And you had the chiefs of staff of the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy. These were General Yumizu and Admiral Toyota. And they effectively were the government of Japan that actually controlled Japan. Nothing could be done without their sanction. And they were set up under a protocol in which the only way that the Big Six could make a decision was with complete unanimity. It had to be a 6-0 vote, or there would be no change in policy, like surrender. And that was deliberately set up to be an ultimate blockade against any possibility of any arrangement for the end of the war that the militarists did not agree with. And they had no intention of surrendering in January 1945. And they had a strategy. They called it Ketsugo, Operation Decisive. They looked around and they said that basically, although the Americans had this tremendous military might and power, that their morale was brittle. It could be broken either by defeating or inflicting totally unacceptable casualties on the initial invasion of Japan. And they looked around and they projected from where they sat in January 1945 that the Americans would be coming for air base sites close to Japan to support an actual invasion, because they expected us to be impatient and insist on invasion rather than blockade and bombardment, which they had no real defense against. And they looked at a map and they said, well, the Americans will come to Okinawa by mid-year. And then they looked at American air bases potentially on Okinawa, and they drew a little, got out their dividers and drew airplane ranges and figured out that, well, the Americans will be coming for southern Kyushu, because that's the most likely target for them to go to, because they want a lot of air base sites. And then they looked at a topographical map of southern Kyushu. And, as I explain sometimes, when you want to know who was a top-rated, or if you want to be a top-rated strategist in the Imperial Army in 1945, you could win that coveted award if you could answer this simple question: where will the Americans build their air bases? On mountaintops or on level ground? Well, you look at a map of southern Kyushu and you see out pops 3 of the 4 projected American invasion beaches, and they start this gigantic buildup of forces on Kyushu, so that by late July, late July, they have 14 divisions and 11 brigades sitting there. Now, as an aside, let me point out that this is one of the biggest issues with this, I really don't like the term revisions. I think anybody who has new evidence or new interpretation of revisions, I call this the critical critique, right? So the problem is they stop in June 1945. They don't tell you about what we found out from radio intelligence about this big, effectively a strategic ambush on Kyushu that was set up. And the Japanese are banking on the fact that they're either going to defeat the initial invasion, or they're going to inflict such casualties that we'll decide to negotiate a peace. That's the Japanese position, right down to August 6, 1945, of the Big Six. And the notion that we, quote, knew they were about to surrender is totally belied, because we were intercepting their communications. This was at 2 levels: the diplomatic communications and the military communications. The diplomatic communications we were reading because we had developed a machine which decoded the main type of Japanese diplomatic codes. In fact, we were decoding them so fast that our leaders very often were able to look at the dispatches before the Japanese recipients did. Yeah. And if you go through piece by piece by piece of those diplomatic messages, what you find out is the emperor finally moved the Big Six to at least authorize an attempt to ostensibly secure a negotiated end of the war using the Soviet Union as the conduit. But if you read the messages, they're trying to do this through the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, a guy named Sato. Mm-hmm. And Sato's messages read, as a lawyer would say, like a cross-examination of fleckless Japanese diplomacy, because he lays it out bit by bit in scathing terms, saying, look, the Soviets are very realistic. They will not accept any effort on our part unless we define terms. Give me terms. And of course, Tokyo can't provide terms, because the Big Six are not going to provide terms until the counter-invasion battle. Yeah. So this goes back and forth. And finally, Sato says in a message that he sends in July, look, the best possible terms Japan can expect at this time is unconditional surrender, modified only to the extent of accepting, preserving the imperial institution. And so we read that. So we know that that's off the table. They're not close to surrender. And then we look at the military messages, and they've got this ambush set up. So that's the situations that actually exists in 1945.
So, and those are the magic communications that are what they're called,
right,
the diplomatic, breaking those diplomatic codes. But, the argument that you see from and I'll just call them revisionists just for shorthand, easier that way, is, you have the peace feelers in Switzerland, in the Soviet Union and Sweden, et cetera, that they're actively trying to surrender. And if we had only said, and again, we're talking about people like Eisenhower in 1965. I mean, Eisenhower was in charge of the war in Europe. He was not privy to a lot of the stuff that was going on in Japan. But the argument is often that if we had just told them that we will retain the emperor, which we did allow after the war, that the emperor retained his position, that was the thing that would have prevented them from fighting for. That was the argument that I saw when I was in college and I was took a course on this, that was the big argument. The Alperwitz was, a number of arguments from people like that, but that was the big one. Just retain the emperor. They're going to do it anyway. So why not just tell them that? And if you tell them that, then they're going to be okay. They're going to surrender. What do you make of that argument?
Let me unpack that a little bit. First of all, there was a group of people I call the peace entrepreneurs, right? These are Japanese diplomats and some military personnel stationed outside of Japan, as you mentioned, typically in Europe. And we were intercepting those and reading those, and we knew that they were getting no response because they had no authorization to act on behalf of Japan.
Yeah.
The only authorized effort to secure a negotiated end to the war was through Moscow. If it wasn't through Moscow, it had no viability whatsoever. But these are held up as though these actually represented some significant element of Japanese policy or policymakers. That simply is not true. Now, with respect to the retention of the emperor, that's a much more nuanced question than is presented there. What actually happens is this: the U.S. government, because there is political pressure in the U.S. to, let's define for the Japanese what unconditional surrender actually means. Maybe they don't understand it. Maybe we just need to define it. I mean, that has a political import, and that gets the Truman administration to issue with the British at the Potsdam Declaration, called this Potsdam Declaration. And what basically this declaration says is that, we're only seeking the surrender of Japan. We have no intent to take any action against ordinary Japanese people. We're just going to hold the leadership responsible. And we tell them that after an occupation, after a period in which we are satisfied that Japan is now both peaceful and democratic, then the final form of government will be freely chosen by the Japanese people. Now, you'll notice that statement in the Potsdam Declaration, which echoes the Atlantic Charter, does not say, oh, by the way, you cannot retain the imperial institution. It's not barred whatsoever from that. And we tell them, if you'll accept those terms, this is the way the war will end. And of course, they look at this in Japan and they reject it because the people who lead Japan at that time, this inner cabinet, the Big Six, are still banking on this Ketsugo counter-invasion battle, which is going to give them far, far better terms than what we are offering. And that's the reality of what's going on there.
Yeah.
Now, let me address for a minute the number of post-war statements by individuals like Eisenhower about how they believed at the time that all we had to do was to throw a bone and the Japanese would surrender. The first thing, if you go back to the original documentation at the time, none of these people said this in 1945. Mm-hmm. None of them. They said this later. Eisenhower came up with his first version of this in 1948, right? And as you correctly point out, he is leading American and Allied forces in Europe. And what is he privy to? He's privy to coded communications relating to that phase of the war. He's not getting the takes that are being sent to the American leaders who are dealing with the Japanese war. We're seeing a very different picture about what's going on. The only thing that Eisenhower gets is he gets some intercepts that the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, a guy named Oshima, has been sending, which contain insights into what the Germans are doing and what Hitler is thinking. That's what he knows. He knows nothing about this stuff. With respect to another famous fellow they cite, Admiral William Leahy, we have everything he said in 1945 prior to the bombings. And you know what that was? He said, I'm an expert on explosives and the atomic bomb will never work. Yeah. That's what he said at the time. Afterwards, when we get in debates about the roles of the Air Force and the Navy, that's when Admiral Leahy comes up with these statements saying, well, I was not trained to make war on women and children. Well, I would refer you to War Plan Orange, the longstanding Navy plan, which by 1945 is looking at starving to death millions of Japanese, including children, including women and children or whatever here. That's the Navy plan. Mm-hmm. He conveniently doesn't bother to mention that. I mean, I just, when you actually go back to the original stuff, it's almost comical how these arguments are put together.
One of the things, and to go back to what Howard Zinn says, no lives were saved. It's a very weird formulation because the job of the American president, of course, in 1945 is to save lives of Americans, young conscripted Americans who would potentially be thrown into an invasion force in, was it Operation Olympic? That was the name of the potential invasion of Japan.
That's the November. There's November invasion. Yeah.
The November invasion of Japan. But you see all these arguments about Truman's memoirs. He says 1 million people. Well, he didn't say that then. It was only 20,000 or 40,000. 20,000, 40,000 Americans dying in an invasion force is pretty substantial. Talk a little bit about that, because you have, obviously the Japanese, it's very, very different than, fighting, say, the Italians. I mean, the kamikaze attacks, the, chitin submarines, suicide submarines, which is kind of foreshadowing a lot of suicide terrorism that's going to happen later in the century. But what were they actually up against? I mean, it's a moral judgment that you can make or choose not to make of whether or not, Truman's responsibility is for one American death, much less 20,000 or 40,000. His decision there has to be, what am I going to do for my own people? But what did that invasion, as a military historian that you are, what does that look like? Because obviously, mountainous region, you have a diminished Japan. As far as oil is concerned, it's quite difficult for them. So many deaths in their own military. They're taking people from 16 years old to 60 years old and women. What would that invasion have looked like, considering so many of the counter arguments these days are that, well, it wouldn't have been that bad, which strikes me as kind of a weird, bizarre argument.
Let me take this in two parts. The first part, let me more directly address exactly what you said now, and then let me come back to the issue of the bombs didn't save any lives, which, by the way, drives my Asian colleagues nuts when they hear that statement or whatever here. The situation was this, and this gets to the heart of part of how that argument is constructed, right? It sort of goes to all stop, typically on the White House meeting of June 18th, 1945, which is where Mr. Truman sat down with his principal advisors and reviewed this projected November invasion, Operation Olympic, going into southern Kyushu. And he's persuaded that he should authorize the operation. Now, at that time, the Japanese garrison was projected to be available to meet us at the invasion sites. There's 3 field divisions and some other folks, maybe about 60,000 troops. And our troop list, which is to say the invasion force that we were sending to southern Kyushu, numbered about 766,000 men in 14 divisions and 3 regimental combat teams and a host of air and naval units. So we appeared to have absolutely overwhelming power going into southern Kyushu at that White House meeting. Now, what this critical or revisionist literature proceeds to do is it pretends that that's where history stops in terms of the invasion of Japan. But history didn't stop there. It was just beginning with respect to the invasion event. Starting from the 9th of July, we start picking up almost daily on a rhythm of 1 or 2, almost every day, Japanese units, which the Japanese have moved down to southern Kyushu as part of their Operation Ketsugo, which they started much earlier in 1945. And we're seeing all these identifications of units so that by the first weeks of August of 1945, we're going in against 3 Japanese divisions. We're going in against 14 divisions and 11 brigades. Mm-hmm. And as one of the analysis puts it, we're going in at a ratio of 1-to-1, and this is not the recipe for victory. Now, what actually is going on here is that the Navy, whose senior officer is the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King, had never, ever wanted to invade Japan. That was anathema to the Navy. The Navy had studied war with Japan literally for 20 years and believed that invading Japan would produce politically unacceptable casualties. And what King had been doing through 44 into 45, he'd been laying the groundwork for a showdown battle to win, which he intended to win, that we were never going to invade Japan. We're going to blockade and bombard, and which I can't emphasize enough. Blockade was about starving to death or threatening to starve to death millions of Japanese. Mm-hmm. That's what blockade was all about. And King now, in August 1945, now has in his hands all this intelligence showing that going into Kyushu looks insane, because although we have a troop list of ostensibly 766,000 men, literally about half of them are going to be support people building airfields or ports or doing other things. We've only got about 380,000 guys who are going to be doing the fighting, and they're going to be facing a garrison on Kyushu of 700, 900,000 men. So King is about to bring this showdown on. In fact, he picks the 9th of August, the day of Nagasaki, to send a message to his colleague in the Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz, who's Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. And he knows already from a message that Nimitz had sent him back in May that Nimitz can no longer support an invasion of Japan. And so he says, King says, give your views to the Army as to an invasion of Japan. So King intends to bring on this showdown over this. He's very confident that Truman is never going to approve an invasion under the circumstances which now exist. So, but this gets lost to history because all this stuff gets classified. We don't hear anything about any of this for 50 years, which is basically that's the vineyards that were being worked by these people, the revisionists, or put this argument together. They simply omit all this evidence which shows that, by God, it looked like a nightmare, a bloodbath, to be going into southern Kyushu in November 1945. And the Navy was saying, hell no, we won't go. Yeah. But they don't tell you that. Yeah. The other thing is this argument about, well, it didn't save any lives. Look, there's about 18 million or almost 18 million people who died in Japan's war who were not Japanese. Civilians. I'm just talking civilians, right? Just between December 1941 and August 1945, 44 months, if you divide the 12 million Chinese who died by 2,962 days, which is how long they fought from July, you get 4,050 deaths every single day. If you do the other 5.8 to 6 million deaths among all the other Asians, almost all Asians who died, you get over 4,300 deaths per day. So basically, you're looking at, 250,000 civilians, almost all Asians, are dying every single month for 45 months from December 1941 to August 1945. And these people say, well, no lives were saved. No lives were saved.
Yeah, I mean, and also
in July, and one more thing.
Yeah, sure.
And there's a massive death among Vietnamese in 1945 between April and August. This is on top of everything I've talked about before. That's 200,000 deaths every month between April and August 1945. So you're talking about 450,000 deaths of civilians, almost all Asians, in July 1945. And they say the war can keep going on and nobody dies.
Yeah, I mean,
I suggest they talk to any competent Asian historian about this.
I mean, if you can widen the aperture of that too to before 1940 and like the invasion of Manchuria and the rape of Nanking, and I mean, absolute a bloodbath. I would recommend to people, by the way, if you want something slightly less academic reading about this topic and about somebody who was slated to go and be part of that invasion force, I would recommend Paul Fussel's essay or book. I think it was an essay called "Thank God for the Bomb," which is pretty interesting from the perspective of somebody that was slated to be part of that invasion force. But what about the second bomb? This is another question. I mean, August 6th, we get the bombing of Hiroshima. By August 9th, we have a second bombing of Nagasaki. There is actually, by the way, a new narrative. Also, I've seen from Tucker Carlson that Nagasaki was the Christian city of Japan, the capital of Japanese Christianity, and was presumably, this is what he's suggesting, is that it was deliberately targeted because they were Christians, which seems like a completely bananas idea to me. But what about the necessity of that second bomb? The first one, the awesome power of that, just wait a few days, wait a few weeks, and they will surrender. Was the second one necessary? You've clearly heard this argument before. What do you make of it?
Well, this gets back to really what's at the bottom of all of this argument about the lack of necessity of the second bomb. It presumes the stupidity and lack of understanding of physics of the Japanese and the Japanese leadership. I mean, that's what it goes down to, because the reality was this: the perceptive people who were planning this right from the get-go there was an admiral named William Purnell he was in a position in one of the supervisory bodies on this. He said right from the beginning that it would take 2 bombs to get the Japanese to surrender. The first bomb was to demonstrate that we in fact had a nuclear weapon, and the second bomb was to imply we had an arsenal of nuclear weapons, and could just keep dropping them. And the guy who headed up the Manhattan Project, General Leslie Groves, picked this up. And most commonly, he also talked about it would take 2 bombs. Sometimes he talked about a little bit more. But what this gets back to is what actually goes on in Japan. And if you understand what actually goes on in the leadership of Japan, you see how fallacious all of this is. The bomb is dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. At first, the only reports reaching outside of the city are that something really horrendous has happened. And the leadership in Tokyo doesn't really know for certain. And then on the morning of August 7th, the day after, they get not only some more reports indicating that 1 bomb supposedly has done this, but then they monitor the broadcast by President Truman that it is, in fact, an atomic bomb. So they have a meeting of this intercabinet, this Big Six, as I described it. And at this cabinet meeting, what comes out immediately is the Imperial Army, led by General Anami, which is by far the most dominant force in Japan at that time. Their immediate response is, well, we're not going to concede that the Americans have an atomic bomb until we have an investigation. But the Imperial Navy, particularly Admiral Toyota, who's the chief of staff in the Navy, says, well, maybe the Americans do have 1 atomic bomb, but they can't have that many. They won't be that powerful. Maybe they'll be dissuaded by international pressure from using further bombs. So right from the get-go, you know that the Japanese leadership is not prepared to immediately surrender on the basis of 1 bomb, and that they understand what an atomic bomb is. And they understand, above all, because they have their own atomic bomb program, which didn't give them an atomic bomb, but it gave them this very basic insight that to have an atomic bomb, you must have fissionable material. Mm-hmm. But producing fissionable material under any process is incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and expensive, far beyond the capability of Japan. And so that's what they're proceeding on, is the notion that, well, even if the Americans had 1 bomb, we're not going to be panicked into surrendering because we don't think they have an arsenal. Now, once you understand that, you understand one other thing, that the idea that a simple demonstration of the bomb would have worked is completely fallacious. Their response to 1 bomb demonstration would have been, very interesting, let's see you do 3 in a row, right? So that's why the Nagasaki bomb is essential, because with the Nagasaki bomb, we have created in their minds the notion that we have not just 1 bomb, but we have an arsenal of atomic bombs that we can just keep dropping rather than invading Japan.
And it takes how long? And almost a week for them to actually surrender after that, right?
Right. Well, what happens? Let me. The surrender process, I think, now's a good time to get in, because we can get into this through this aperture about the bombs, because this does have what we now know, in fact, from relatively recent developments we've had with respect to our understanding of Japan. Shortly after the war, the foreign minister, this fellow named Togo Shigenori, he said that he met with Emperor Hirohito on August 8th, 1945. And at that time, the emperor told him that the war must end now. Now, chronologically, the significance of this is that this is after Hiroshima, but this is before Soviet intervention during the night of August 8th, 9th, 1945, and before the Nagasaki bomb on August 9th, 1945. And I approached this evidence as a lawyer did, as a lawyer does, which is to say, my first question was not, does this help or hurt any particular argument I wanted to support? My first question was this credible? As a lawyer would say, is it of probative value? Well, the problem when I was looking at this in the early 1990s was that it was a standalone statement by Togo, and there was no supporting evidence whatsoever to back him up. And there were a number of Japanese officials we knew right after the war who, of course, are making all kinds of statements to try to keep the emperor on the throne, Emperor Hirohito on the throne. So I discounted it at that time. Since that time, we've had not one but two verifications that exactly this conversation took place and some elaboration on it. First of all, as usual with a meeting of the emperor, there was a member of the imperial household staff present, and he wrote up a memorandum of that conversation, which verifies the emperor's statements almost word for word. And secondly, it turns out that Togo came back after the meeting, and he dictated a diary entry to his aide, who became his brother-in-law, which also verifies this. And what's interesting in these more elaborate versions is the emperor said expressly, first of all, well, now that the Americans have an atomic bomb, that's it. Ketsugo is no longer a viable strategy. So he's basically said the basic strategy that the Japanese militarists had to end the war is now kaput. It's no longer, and the war must end now. And unlike the other leadership, Hirohito is on a straight line from that moment, from the 8th of August to his final broadcast on the 15th. The war must end now. He's consistent through that whole period. With respect to the other members, as you pointed out, there is, when we respond to this, because the Japanese in their initial surrender offer have a little bit of trickery in it, or a poison pill, you might call it, which is to say the original message was supposed to say it accepts the Potsdam Declaration, but it also added language that would make it clear that the Japanese expected us not only to accept that offer, but we should also recognize the emperor as supreme over the supreme allied commander of the occupation force. In other words, the emperor would have veto power over occupation reforms. And our State Department people pick up on exactly what the Japanese are trying to do with sort of hocus pocus language. And we send what's called the Burns Note. And the first and most important declaration in the Burns Note is that from the moment of surrender, the supreme allied commander will be supreme over the Japanese government. We clarify that. And we come back to that same point again, that the ultimate form of government will be chosen by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people, which of course leaves an opening for the emperor or someone to be an emperor of Japan.
Yeah.
So that's, it's that's sort of the short course.
Yeah. Richard, I want to bring in a caller, a listener, a viewer who has a question for you. We have Aaron.
Sure.
Is Aaron there? Hey, Aaron, how's it going, buddy?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was a complete honor to have you here, Mr. Frank. I actually read your Operation Downfall that in the late or early 2000s, I guess came out in the late 90s. And I've been part of a history group that we've done over 1,000 videos. And I did a couple presentations using your source material on Operation Downfall. And it's somewhat strange that we aren't taught the continuation of what the battle plans were for the Pacific. It's this sort of fait accompli assumption that the atomic weapons were going to work, and not just work technically, but actually work politically. Right. And my question is, can you maybe enrich us a little bit about the effectiveness, because the Japanese predicted literally to the beach where we were going to land. And on top of having 2 to 3 times more forces than we expected them to have, and at the same time, a whole, you can almost call it like a suite of suicide forces, right? They were planning on, I think, 3,000-4,000 suicide vessels, which were going to just come out and attack, obviously any landing forces anywhere and naval ships, and then obviously 5,000-10,000 plus, one way, basically cruise missile planes, cruise missiles with wings on them, towards our ships. And my question really is that, for some reason we don't have the ability to package the atrocities that the Japanese committed starting really in the 20s, when they started executing and murdering their prime ministers and the political leaders with their young officers corps. And is your feeling that that's just because of the rehabilitation Japan has had in sort of modern society, and it's Japan's a normal country with normal Western kind of living and lifestyle and integration, or is there something deeper that is sort of Eurocentric where, because we just had so much history from the United States with fighting Europeans and European wars, that we just really diminished any sort of Asianness. And I don't mean to make it sound kind of wokey in that,
Right.
but actually, because we don't value the fact that basically the Japanese and their proxies, killed pretty close to the same numbers that the Germans killed. But if you ask 99% of people, they're historians, they wouldn't even give you that number.
Aaron, I want to add, before I throw to Richard, I want to add something briefly to that. But, the memory of the Holocaust that we've been exceptionally good at, I mean, the Germans have been exceptionally good at it, that we don't have any sense. You can say SS to people, they will know what you're talking about. You can say Treblinka, Medanjak, you can say there's people. If you say Unit 731, you're going to get a blank stare. I don't think anyone knows what Unit 731 was in the brutality of the Japanese military during that game. But I'll throw it to you, Richard. I think it's a very, very good question, Aaron. What do you make of it?
It is a good question. Let me tell you a story. This number of years ago, I was at a conference and I was going over this. And of course, one of the things I was emphasizing was this very basic point that to understand the mentality of this Supreme Council for Direction of the War, the Japanese militarists, seems so totally alien to Western values, American values. It's extraordinarily difficult to actually believe there were people like that roaming the earth. And after I made my presentation, a Japanese historian came up to me, who I later became a good friend with, and I said, it's really hard to explain this to an American audience. And he looks at me and he says, you should try explaining it to a Japanese audience. That it seems totally alien to where the Japanese are today. And you get back to this whole notion that on the casualty issue, but which so much time and effort has been made. I made a couple of very basic points. First of all, in 1945, there was no scientific method for estimating in advance military casualties. There were too many unknown unknowns, and we knew it. And if you actually read through, and I have read through every single piece of paper that talked about this through 1945, through that White House meeting typically, or whatever here, and you'll see that when people tried to address the issue, which you would seem a straightforward question, well, how many losses do we expect to sustain in invading Japan? And you find that more often than not, they don't give you an explicit number. They go to, it'll be an analogy, like this, that, or the other. It'll be, and you pick where you are on the spectrum of an analogy. And then what happens is the whole picture radically changes after June 18th. And you're looking at this absolutely horrific picture of going in at the odds of 3-1 or better, whatever here. Okay, you don't have to have an advanced degree from military academy to figure out that if you're going in at 1-3, this is not a recipe for victory. It is an absolute recipe for a bloodbath, right? Mr. Truman, who had combat experience in World War I, understood that very well. Mr. Truman did not have to have someone sit down like a bean counter and say, well, now the figures are a little different, Mr. President. It's not 20,000. It's more like, let's call it 250,000, and then we still got to do Tokyo, right? So the whole casualty issue thing, it just completely goes off the tracks when you realize that what we thought we were going to get, which is what all the debate's been about in terms of giving lower numbers about what's going on. And you can see it, for instance, in General Marshall, who, given a lot of those numbers, I believe he was acting in good faith on June 18th because he hadn't really grappled as extensively with fighting the Japanese as the Navy had. That's one thing. And the other thing is he was still applying a Eurocentric orientation. After he realizes what's going on, what does he do? He sends one of his staff officers to talk to someone at the Manhattan Project, one of the principals of the Manhattan Project. And we have the transcript of that discussion, right? And that transcript, the emissary from General Marshall says, well, General Marshall now believes that after 2 bombs, atomic bombs, the Japanese will surrender now after 2 bombs, or no amount of atomic bombing will get them to surrender. So we want to use all the remaining nuclear weapons that we're going to have by the 1st of November for Operation Olympic. Suppose we want to use them as we now call tactical weapons. Well, what do you think about that? How many are going to be, and what do you think about it? And what the guy from the Manhattan Project replies is, well, we're probably going to have about 7 by the 1st of November. And in terms of safety, the only issue the Manhattan representative talks about is, what if we drop one of these and it does not go off?
Yeah.
There is no discussion of potential radiation exposure to our troops, whatever here, because they just did not understand it at that time. The scientists who had done this marvelous work to come up with the theoretical prospect of an atomic weapon and the practical reality of making one, they had recognized that radiation would be a hazard, but they had convinced themselves all the way up to Oppenheimer that anyone who was close enough to get a lethal dose of radiation would already have been killed by heat or blast. That's how they were seeing it. I have said many times in these presentations that had someone from the Manhattan Project come to President Truman and his advisors and said, okay, besides blast and heat, like a bomb, like a bigger bomb, which is what they were thinking of, if you'd explain to the policymakers, well, this radiation killing people, this is something akin to poison gas. And that was the only taboo the U.S. was still abiding by in 1945, was no first use of poison gas. Now, I don't say that would have made them turn away from using the bombs. I will say it would have made them think a little bit longer about whether they were going to use bombs or not, because it was stepping on the one taboo they still recognized. As long as it was blast and heat, they were willing to go ahead as they will. And well, let me add one other point, which is very interesting. In the fall of 1944, Vannevar Bush, who headed up the whole scientific research project for the U.S. during World War II, and the president of Harvard University, James Conant, are sitting down and talking about what to do, because at that point they believe that we are going to have a nuclear weapon in the time frame of World War II, which was not a clear-cut thing. As it turned out, we only have it by the time the Japanese are still available. That we would have dropped a bomb on Germans if we had it in time. We just didn't have it. So they're talking about using the bombs. And the point of their conversation is that it's essential that a nuclear bomb be used on a city. And they say this not because they're more bloodthirsty than anyone else, but because they already foresee that the bombs that are going to be available in 1945 are very minor in their power compared to the exponentially greater power of the weapons that will come down the pike. And they believe that only by dropping it on a city and graphically demonstrating the power of just the atomic bomb available in 1945 can they pursue international control of atomic weaponry. So you might say that the first anti-nuclear act of the nuclear age was the dropping of those bombs to persuade nations and peoples that some control had to be imposed over nuclear weapons and make it a taboo that would never be crossed again.
And it hasn't been. Thank you so much for the question, Aaron, as always. Smart, interesting question. And just to end on this, we've kept you a while. I mean, I could keep going for another hour. I'm sorry, guys, but this is absolutely fascinating to me. I wanted to ask you about Oppenheimer. Did you see Oppenheimer? What did you think of the film? Because I saw the criticism of the film that it didn't show the actual real consequences of the Manhattan Project on the ground. There was a number of people who made that, which, by the way, is a different movie. It's just complaining they didn't make the same movie that you wanted them to make. But
Right.
Did you see the film, and what did you think of it?
Oh, yeah. Interesting. Of course, you're what my wife sometimes refers to as my playmates. I was given a heads up that the movie was coming out. And the basic thing, I was impressed. There was a serious attempt to do serious history in that movie. I mean, I agree with everything in it, but I think in terms of a Hollywood treatment of a big, heavy-duty historical moral issue, that was a credit to the people who produced that movie overall.
Yeah.
And I understand the criticism of we didn't show, but the people who say that are the same people who don't want to tell you about those 18 million other Asians, mostly Asians, who died due to Japan's war. They've erased those people entirely. So for them to come in and say, well, Oppenheimer didn't cover the horrors of the atomic bomb, I say, well, if you talked about these 18 million other people who died due to Japan's war, you'd have a much better ground to stand on to criticize an Oppenheimer for not showing what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, I liked the movie considering I didn't like the Kai Bird book that it was based on. So that was a positive thing. Richard Frank, the book, I say this like it's a new book. It's not a new book, but you can still go get it. Downfall from 1999, and it stands the test of time as the best book on the subject. Tower of Skulls is the latest. That's the most recent one, right, Richard?
Right. Well, actually, let me just put in a brief comment about that. Essentially, what I'm trying to do in Tower of Skulls is to write a history that puts these 18 million other dead back into the history.
Yeah.
Mainly, almost all are Asians. And I mean, the purpose of this is to make people realistically understand what the Asia-Pacific War was all about, who died, why they died, where they died, how they died. That's a major part of this, besides just the military narrative about what a near one thing actually all of World War II was through 1942.
Yeah, it's unfortunately an appropriate title. Well, thank you very much, Richard, and appreciate it. And all of you should go out and buy the book. And all of you should also go over to our YouTube channel, The Moynihan Report, and at Moynihan Report, and subscribe so you can see the next version of this. I mean, I'm sorry, guys, but I love nerdy, in-depth history stuff. If you have suggestions of other things you want me to cover, I might ignore you, but this is a thing that totally fascinates me. And if you want me to follow up and do another one, I will. I don't care if no one watches it, because Richard Frank is a phenomenal historian, and we appreciate him coming. And we'll see you next time, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 o'clock. Go over and subscribe, and we will see you soon. Bye.